Before we get on with today's formal questions, there's an idea I'm trying to express that maybe you'd like to help me. And it's about the environment is a big topic at the moment.
Yeah.
And I've been talking about this with some folks from TED. And my proposition, which we may have heard before, is that the people who are talking about environmental change aren't really equipped to do that because they think it's about education. And if we've learned anything from the last 5 years, it's changing minds and changing cultures isn't about information.
No, absolutely not.
And I'm trying to convey that.
Absolutely. Saving the environment's not about educating people to eat more lentil loaf. Saving the environment is about using ruthless means of propaganda to forcibly convince people, because it's too important of an issue to say that the ends don't justify the means. Absolutely, the ends justify the means in this case. Let's use propaganda.
Oh, yeah. Well, we've seen how well propaganda works over the last 5 years or whatever.
Right.
And I've been impatiently waiting for the Democrats to notice that. But yeah, that is what has to be done. Nobody is motivated without the emotions.
Uh-huh.
Where's that word come from anyway?
Emotion? Like motion?
Well, it's got motion in it.
But my personal view on this is that religion needs to be involved.
I agree.
And it cannot come from any other source, because anytime there has ever been fundamental massive change, it's always come from religion. And even the few times that it ostensibly could have been said to have been secular, it actually was a secular religion. Once you had the change of Marxism happening, by that time, as you could see from the Soviet Union or North Korea or China, it was turned into a secular religion. People believe in this. Marx and Lenin were their prophets. And so we cannot just go about this in a secular way and rational way. There needs to be some sort of religious impulse involved. There has to be something millenarian involved here. People need to do this because they fundamentally believe it needs to be done. And the only examples in history, thousands of years of history of every culture, where people willingly gave things up and sacrifice for the betterment of humanity were because of religion, not because it was the best thing to do. And people will have to sacrifice if the environment's to be saved.
Yeah. The point is, it may be the best thing to do, but it's not necessarily the most immediately profitable.
Right.
Yeah. And one of my gripes about all the attempts to do something practical about climate, it boils down to who's going to make and who's going to lose money. And you have to have somewhere for the sense of the sacred to enter the argument, or it will peter out, even if it's well-intentioned.
Yes, that argument is that the environment needs to be saved because it is intrinsically valuable, not because it's useful.
Right, exactly.
And that's the problem with the environmentalists, and why I can no longer identify as an environmentalist, because the environmentalists today, most of them view it as in terms of usefulness and sustainability. It's not like we should honor the environment because flowers are pretty and we should keep the flowers. No, we should preserve the environment in order to sustain ourselves longer. It's the more reasonable thing to do to keep our standard of civilization as long as we can. And I don't think that that's a valid thing.
No, I don't think it can work that way. Some of the people that are really deeply into these questions are the anti-growth people. I'm not sure if that's the right term or not. But they're basically saying, we have to free ourselves from this addiction to growth and live within our means. And a lot of them are not popular.
But they're smart. They know what they're talking about. Everyone from Ivan Illich to E.F. Schumacher to many, many others have stated the same thing. And it's also about reevaluating things. It's not saying everything modern is bad or all technology is bad, but simply let's slow down and reevaluate things and reevaluate what we need. And maybe when we come up with something new and people buy it, maybe let's make sure that they can have this item for a long time and it's repaired and repairable. And let's make sure that there's not like this constant need to consume more and more and more things. I mean, there's nothing inherently wrong with the old forms of capitalism. The old forms of capitalism were great because it emphasized small business. It was actually helping the makers, homo faber, the people that were artisans. But now, the people that are the makers are the people that are suffering the most. There's no room for makers. There's only room for assembly line automatons. And even in the
we're just another resource to be exploited.
Yeah, even in the high paid occupations for tech workers, you know, you and I know of a time when it was sort of a bit different. It was less alienating. One person would create one program from beginning to end. But now it's no different than any other assembly line method of doing things, that one person never does one thing. One person does one little part of the program, and so they are completely alienated from the product of their labor.
Yeah, you know, I gave up trying to I can't avoid it conceptually, I suppose, but you're really trying to understand how the web works now compared to when I first got on the web and started programming websites. And I can't tell, you know, it's like if somebody puts together a community website, you know, it's going to be written in some language that is specific to, you know, particular box of tools and widgets and stuff like that. And you can't, it's just not, I mean, you can learn how to do basic things and even layer upon layer make them complicated. You can program bottom up or top down. But if you have to know all the different developers packages that are available, all the different libraries you're going to use, it just gets exhausting before you even get started. That's what I think, which I guess is sort of why I just decided to retire.
Yes.
I mean, you couldn't stick with a particular way of doing things or a particular skill long enough to really appreciate it before you had to substitute something else for it. It was running fast just to stay in place. Or as I sometimes say, that always having new things gets old.
Well said.
Yeah, when newness gets old, it's time to retire.
And old things are the most wonderful things. I mean, old things have a story to go along with them. Old things have a particular sight, smell, feeling, touch. Nothing's better than old book, a real treasure that's been lovingly used, or an old cast iron pan that's been used for, 100 years and maybe needs a little bit of TLC, but is just as good or better than it was, 50 years ago. You don't have that with the newest devices. It's like an addiction. People get the new thing and then it gets old really quick, and then it ends up in the landfill and the next new thing is coming around.
Yeah, the funny thing about a lot of these technology products are that they seem to really open up a lot of possibilities, but in fact they limit them very greatly because, there's only some things you can do and you have to do them in certain ways, and there are other things that it wasn't designed for you to do, and you can't make it do, even though theoretically it's possible. So people are always upgrading because they're going to think they're going to get something so much different, but it's really not that much different, until you can have a handheld device that immerses you in virtual reality, which I'm afraid will happen at some point.
Well, just speaking about upgrades, it's annoying to me personally that the only things that seem to be getting quote unquote upgraded are electronic devices, but everything else is getting downgraded. The quality of clothes, shoes, books, furniture, houses, quality of pretty much everything is going down. The only thing that's getting so-called better, or at least faster, are gadgets.
Yeah, and they're both motivated by basically profit.
Right.
And the dark side of capitalism is that it gets to be all about the money. Now, originally, capitalism is just a recognition of a kind of reality that we live in, that things need to be exchanged for other things, and, there's a way it works. But now that, with corporate reality, you can't have any higher purpose than satisfying your shareholders. I mean, there are certainly corporations that are not hamstrung by that, but when it gets right down to it, the notion of being a good corporate citizen is a bunch of crap. Because if you're too good a citizen, you'll find your position on the board challenged. So anyway, not everything that really, really needs to be done can be done at a significant profit. So if the things that get done are determined, by whether or not you can make enough money compared to something else, there are a lot of things that will never get chosen because, you could buy a certificate of deposit and get a better return maybe. If it's worth doing, it might be worth operating theoretically at a loss, which is kind of what adapting to climate change is going to require. At least it's going to feel like a loss initially. But there's value in sacrifice, and sacrifice really doesn't have a lot of meaning outside some sense of spirituality.
Right.
So, we need a spiritual reason to do these things.
Well, what you say, Seda Badria, about changes brought about by belief and is certainly true, and as you say, evident in history. The problem with the environmental movement is we don't have that kind of time.
Right.
Yeah, but everything else moves fast, so that's what makes it so urgent.
Right. Now that, as you say, finally has to be the bedrock or a component part, or finally what it's all about. But right now, what we need are the best tools of persuasion and propaganda.
Yeah. You have to trick people into understanding sometimes.
Right.
I mean, you have to get past their incorrect assumptions or their prejudices or whatever. Comedy's good for that, but maybe we need more environmental comedians.
I mean, clearly half of this country is right, at least half of it is ripe for propaganda.
Oh,
and,
yeah.
In some countries, you have the conservative movements actually being the party that's more environmentalist than the liberal or progressive parties, which in many respects makes sense.
That's what conservatives mean.
Yeah, so things are a bit backwards in this country, but in all honesty, I think the rural populations that are more directly affected by climate change are more open, could be more open to this. I think what we need to get is a Republican that actually is willing to use their propaganda, but in the service of the environment.
Yeah. Well, the people who live closer to the land are more sensitive to the changes. So it'd be good to direct their attention.
Okay, that's one thing.
I mean, if your crop yield starts going down, you'll pay attention. But by that time, you may be on your way out of business.
But then again, people are they don't have consideration. And, at one point when I was on that trip to Taos and I was camping in a rather remote spot, I prefer not to build fires at all, simply because I'm fine with cold food while I'm traveling. But if I were to build a fire, there's plenty of downed twigs. But not too far away, I could hear someone with a chainsaw cutting down different things just simply because they think it's so much fun to cut down the trees to build the fire, even though they could have easily used downed wood to make the fire.
Sure. Well, and there's also a sensitivity that one ought to have about building a fire outside in terms of, is it just weighed down heavily with thick smoke, or does it burn with hardly any smoke, which is more efficient, of course.
Right. And according to many anthropologists, the earliest form of religion was tree worship, at least in most parts of Europe. And tree worship is a religion I can totally get down with. I mean, we need more tree worshipers out there. And I'm not talking tree huggers. I mean actual tree worshipers. And that's one of the sad things that died along with the advent of Christianity, because there was almost sort of like a genocide of the trees, because when Christianity became the official state religion, they realized that many of these groves were sacred and had 1,000-year-old trees that no one, even the worst criminal, would consider harming or cutting down because they were sacred to the gods. And so they're like, okay, they're sacred to the gods, so let's cut them down. And I'll never really forgive Christianity for that.
Yeah, they're sacred to the wrong gods. Well, we're fallen, we're motivated, and pay attention to the things that are closest to us. And those are small compared with some of the things that are far from us and look small from a distance. And there's some pathology. I mean, I think there are different types of people and different aptitudes and things like that. But people don't consider what they call abstract to be real. And, they hear things talked about using analogies or pointing to data or something like that. And it's not immediate for them. And I don't know why a concept can't be more compelling than it usually is. I mean, you have to remember it's just a concept, but there's a lot there in some of those concepts.
So Sheikh Al-Bashir, what are your ideas? You're an idea person. What are your ideas to save the world?
I'd like to start an organization similar to the CIA that would monitor the news worldwide and be able to insert environmental memes across the world so that every decision has an environmental component.
Right. That's what's needed. It has to be a conscious effort to seed the memes into the population.
Yes, exactly.
It's not the same as advertising. It's a little bit of subterfuge.
That's right.
But only in the sense that they don't know what you're doing necessarily. They may think you're doing it for no reason or some other reason. So in a sense, you've deceived them about what you're up to.
Well, yes, I mean, it is essentially non-democratic. It is necessarily manipulative, but it needn't be unethical.
No, exactly. It need not be.
So that's what I want to do.
I think that's exactly right. I think, this is another place where at least some art could have a big role. But, it just could be inserted in so many different ways and positioned, as they say in marketing, positioned with relation to a whole bunch of other things that people don't immediately think have connection with those memes. If you can get them associated, then you don't have to repeat them all the time. People will remember them in some context. But you still have to get the memes out.
Yes, all true.
You could take over some popular music.
Mm-hmm.
That would be a good one. It would be harder to do with a television program, but I'm sure if that were the goal, it could be done.
Well, instead of having to figure this out ourselves, the thing I would first do is go to some professionals in this area and counsel with them or buy their time and say, how is this done? If we're trying to make the world safe for democracy, or if we're, trying to sell more dishwashing detergent, what are the variables? What are the dimensions? What are the linguistic concerns?
And what gets traction and what doesn't? Yeah, it's subtle. It's a psychological war, basically.
Yeah, that's the way to describe it.
Or you could think of it in terms of a war of self-defense.
Yes.
It doesn't have to be, an offense.
No. Just those kinds of concerns or issues are worth pondering.
Well, yeah. And, so much of what needs to change is really in our self-interest. We just don't know what our self is.
And I definitely think that is what's needed. But over time, I've grown even more cynical than I already was. So I'm not sure how much anything will work. And for that reason, I think we need a backup plan. And the thing that I've been working on over the last year or so is precisely that backup plan, a retreat into the desert of sort. How can we create small autonomous communities that come together, that have the skills and the knowledge and the willingness to live without all the conveniences of modern technology, that are able and willing to live the way their ancestors lived, but yet have the abundance of their ancestors because so much of it's been removed. And I think we need that because ultimately, I think bad things are coming. But even in Chernobyl, nature is recovering in various ways. And so I do think Gaia will win, but the human civilization might not make it out the other side.
Right.
And it's, of course, a philosophical question of asking, well, is the human civilization deserving of making it through to the other side? I'm not sure. It depends on which side of the bed I wake up in the morning, which way I'd answer that. But I would certainly say there are parts of civilization that I've grown to like and love, and I would hope that, if I can foster some small communities to come together, that if the disaster does happen, that these communities would be the germs of let's say, a kinder and gentler humanity.
Right. The people that go and try to get off grid and live closer to the land, I think, are preserving, if not resurrecting, a lot of old, what we might call appropriate technology. And kind of like the people that live in the forest in Fahrenheit 451, they can be a well of knowledge if they've learned how to do these things with less. When we have no choice about whether or not we're going to have less, these people will be valuable. Most people want to know how to stay alive.
Yes, well, everybody wins, if we can solve this problem.
Yeah.
Including the coral and the polar bears.
Absolutely. And the problem isn't solved if we haven't addressed their needs.
Right, that's exactly right.
I've solved the problem of the polar bears. I mean, you see the pictures of the polar bears are hungry, the world is overpopulated, so start feeding people to the polar bears.
Sure.
Like the worst polluters, whoever litters along the highway, it's no longer a $500 fine, but you get fed to a polar bear.
Well, we get people's attention. But, unfortunately, it's probably not going to work this way, but justice would be to have all the people that stand as obstacles to saving the planet, is that every time there's a part of the planet that gets uninhabitable, banish them to that place. Well, barely habitable. It's like putting the Native Americans on reservations. Welcome to Fort Stinkin' Desert, Outpost and Indian Reservation. That's from Fireside Theater. There were a lot of good memes that came in through them.
Yes.
It could be done.
I mean, what was it back in the 70s? There was that commercial that affected so many people that had the Native American on the...
Oh, yes, right.
And with the tear.
And that actually got people to, think about things. But I haven't noticed anything like that in recent times.
Well, in those days, broadcast stations were expected to provide some time for public service and, non-commercial messages and things. And some of them satisfied that by carrying some religious programs on Sunday morning. But things like the Native American on the horse shedding a tear, I saw that quite a number of times when it was running. I was surprised how many stations ran it.
Yes, it was a classic and very moving.
Very moving, that's right. I think since then I've seen one thing that attempts to do that kind of thing, but nowhere near as powerful. I can't remember what it was, so that tells you, doesn't it?